Top 10 facts Atlantis was a real place. Plato's Atlantis has received more than its fair share of ridicule. The pile of logical fallacies used against the subject is thick and dark. Once you've been made aware of the muddy thinking used to argue against Atlantis, there will be no going back. You will no longer be able to remain a slave to such muddy thinking. I've had a geologist from an Ivy League university claim that Atlantis never existed because no evidence. On the topic of geology, we have plenty of evidence. Clearly, he had not studied his own literature well enough or had not completely thought through the shallow claims of others. In the mid-1950s, engineer and science fiction author Sprague wrote a book criticizing others for believing in places like Atlantis. His book has been called a monument to scholarship. The ironic fact is that his book is shoddy work even for a high school student. As a college professor, I would have given his book a C- grade for the heavy use of logical fallacies and zero evidence that Atlantis could not have existed. The only thing that saved his work from total failure was his occasional restraint from jumping to unfounded conclusions. But his restraint was unevenly applied. My recent book, Mission Atlantis, goes through all the gory details, finding all of the Atlantis skeptics failing or nearly failing in their arguments. But Mission Atlantis, the book, focuses more on the evidence we do have. While the body of evidence is still not proof, it shows how bad has been the science and critical thinking of the Atlantis skeptics against the subject. Here are the top 10 facts which support the hypothesis that Plato's Atlantis was a real place as he had described. Number 10. Genetics. mtDNA haplogroup X. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down through the mother from generation to generation. One rare genetic group, mtDNA haplogroup X, has been found clustered around all of the regions thought to have been related to the children of Atlantis, including locations of earliest archaeology and megalithic structures, plus earliest civilization. This rare genetic type is also found amongst the Basques of northern Spain and southern France, as well as a few of the Native American tribes like the Ojibwa, Sioux, and Navajo. Notice the locations: North America and clustered in Europe and Western Asia. There is almost no evidence of haplogroup X in Eastern Asia on the way to Alaska and North America, suggesting that the ancestors may have crossed the Atlantic Ocean, or that both groups left Atlantis, which would have been between the two locations. Genetic testing shows that the two sets were separated by 12,000 years or more. Atlantis supposedly sank 11,600 years ago, only 400 years from the rough genetic estimate, a virtual bullseye on the geological and genetic timescales. Number 9. Anthropology. Cro-Magnons and Basques. The ancient Western Europeans, or Cro-Magnon man, have lived there for something like 40,000 years, arriving there from an unknown location. There is no evidence that they traveled through Europe or Africa to get to the western regions of Europe, North Africa, and the islands off the western coast. Anthropologists have long known about 4 different invasions, each one with a more advanced toolkit. In Europe, they were the Aurignacian, Solutrean, Magdalenian, and Azilian. In Africa, they were the Atarian, Oranian, Muilian, and Capsian cultures. And these Western Europeans did not look like the Eastern Europeans who did show a pattern of migration into Western Europe, but who did not seem to have picked up the Cro-Magnons' more advanced toolkits. Number 8. Geology. Damaged tectonic plate boundary. The Africa-Eurasia tectonic boundary between Azores and Gibraltar is indistinct, as if damaged. Jimenez Montt et al., in a 2001 paper, discussed this unsettling fact. The paper stated, quote, "The eastern segment is not so well defined and deformation spreads over a much broader area." End quote. Number 7. Geology. Jumbled seafloor. Even a casual glance at a topographical map of the seafloor shows a great deal of complexity in the northeast Atlantic Ocean. Instead of a smooth abyssal plain, there are a great many bumps, ridges, underwater mountains, and canyons. Number 6. Geology. Azores Underwater Plateau. The single largest feature of the northeast Atlantic is the Azores Underwater Plateau, which rises at least a kilometer above the surrounding ocean floor. The entire Azores archipelago sits atop this massive plateau. What could have created this huge tabletop mountain under the ocean? Number 5. Geology. Evidence that the Africa tectonic plate was deflected. A 1980 paper by R. Searle points out that the sudden bend in the Africa-Eurasia plate boundary was formed 36 million years ago. This indicates a sudden shift in the direction of the Africa tectonic plate with respect to the Eurasia, leading to a pattern of local rotation, as if the Africa plate had collided with something that the Eurasia plate could not swallow. That would be our large island of Atlantis. This deflection has resulted in the creation of the ultra-slow spreading center known as the Terceira Ridge. Instead of running from east to west like the majority of the Africa-Eurasia tectonic plate boundary, this geologically new ridge runs from southeast to northwest. Number 4. Date. Paleoclimate. Abrupt end of the Younger Dryas. Plato told us that the large island of Atlantis sank about 9,600 BC. Well, we have a sudden change in planetary climate happening at 9620 BC, the sudden end of the Younger Dryas Big Freeze. Scientists suggest that the Younger Dryas was started by a huge spill of cold, lightweight water from a location in central Canada called Lake Agassiz. This freshwater cap put a stop on the Gulf Stream, driven by the thermohaline or temperature salinity circulation. One surefire way to end something like that ice water cap is to stir up the Atlantic Ocean. And an island the size of Greenland collapsing up to 1 kilometer into the Atlantic Ocean could have created waves as much as 1 to 3 kilometers high. That's the stuff of nightmares, making the Hollywood waves and disaster movies look like kid stuff. Number 3. Date. Geology. Volcanic proxy record in Greenland ice cores. If Atlantis existed, it included the volcanic region of the Azores, and a massive region with active volcanoes collapsing into the ocean would likely set off one or more of those volcanoes. And bingo! In the Greenland GISP2 ice core data for 9620.77 BC, we have evidence of a moderately large volcanic eruption occurring somewhere in the world. The trace doesn't tell us the source of the location, but the date screams Atlantis. This volcanic event tapered off over the next 2 years in the ice core proxy record. Number 2. Date. Oceanography. Significant drop in sea levels worldwide. In a paper by R. Fairbanks from 1989 for Nature magazine, we see proxy data for 17,000 years of worldwide sea levels as all that North Polar ice melted, freeing up the northern regions of North America and Europe. The Younger Dryas Big Freeze shows up on that graph of data as a significant slowdown in the rising sea levels. Right at the end of that return to colder climate, we see a sudden drop in sea levels of approximately 2 meters. When we do the proper calculations, we find that a Greenland-sized island sinking 1 kilometer into the ocean could produce about the right amount of sea level drop to match the Fairbanks proxy record. Score another win for Atlantis. Number 1. Location. Tectonic plate boundary. Most mountains and islands form near the margins of tectonic plates. Plato's Atlantis straddled the Africa-Eurasia plate boundary. There are 3 types of tectonic plate boundaries: convergent, transform, and divergent. All plate margins or boundaries are notorious for earthquakes. This is simply because massive slabs of rock rubbing against other massive slabs of rock will not result in a smooth action. Divergent boundaries are margins where new plate material grows. Examples are the Mid-Atlantic Ridge and the very young Terceira Ridge in the Azores, or Old Atlantis. Transform boundaries slide by one another, moving parallel to the boundary itself. Perhaps the most famous of this type is the San Andreas Fault Line in California, USA. San Diego, Los Angeles, and part of San Francisco reside on the Pacific Plate, while the remainder of California resides on the North America Plate. Convergent boundaries are those that are coming together. When two or more oceanic margins converge, usually one slides under the other in an action known as subduction. The plate edge that descends into the Earth's mantle is ultimately dissolved by the intense heat, effectively recycling the plate material. This also happens when an oceanic margin converges with a continental margin, like the Pacific Plate converging with the South America Plate. This is what created the South American mountain range, the Cordilleras. Sometimes subduction can't happen because the underlying plate is too thick with continental material. This happened when, after 50 million years of convergence, the Indian island finally collided with the Eurasian continent. This created a condition known as compressive folding, or orogeny, mountain building. Something happened near the North Atlantic Triple Junction to damage the Africa-Eurasia plate boundary. For several years, I thought it might have been a tectonic traffic jam when the Africa continent finally collided with the Eurasia near Persia, modern Iran. This may have slowed down the creation of new Africa plate material on the other end of the Africa-Eurasia boundary, right at the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This damage could have become an impediment to the rather immediate subduction of the new Africa plate material underneath the Eurasia, a few kilometers farther east. But now I'm thinking that the damage to the Africa-Eurasia boundary could have been far more random. A 2005 paper and USGS infographic by J.T. Hagstrum provides us with this new possibility. An asteroid or giant meteorite could have punched a hole in the Earth's crust on one side of the planet and generated sufficient shock waves to damage the antipodal point on the Earth. His paper explains that sometime before 50 million years ago, a giant meteor struck the Earth either at the location of the Azores or at a point on the opposite side of the planet, creating what is now called the Azores hotspot. The Mission Atlantis hypothesis is that this damage could have been sufficient impediment to subduction that the Africa plate stopped subducting locally and began mountain building, mountains which eventually became an island. When the mountains on that island became too tall, the Africa could not push them any higher, effectively stopping the Africa plate locally, and 36 million years ago, forcing the Africa plate to start rotating because of the obstruction. The rest of the story is described in more detail in the book. Alternate possibilities. None of these facts yet prove Atlantis. Each of them has other possible reasons for their appearance as evidence of past events. However, these are not the only pieces of evidence. There are dozens of others, each supporting the past existence of Atlantis. What would it take to prove, one way or the other, whether or not Atlantis really existed? That question is answered in detail in my book, Mission Atlantis, available at many major online retailers as either an ebook or in print.